July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong becomes the first human to walk on the moon. The triumph of American engineering. The victory of the space race. A moment when humanity looked up at another world and said, "We made it." But here's what they don't tell you in the documentaries. What gets edited out of the highlight reels. What NASA spent decades trying to bury. Before Armstrong stepped onto that lunar surface, at least 8 men died trying to get him there. Some were erased because their deaths were embarrassing. Killed by birds, by fog, by mistakes too mundane for the heroic narrative. Some were erased because their programs were classified, their missions too secret to mourn in public. And some were erased because admitting what killed them would have meant admitting NASA knew it was coming, that the agency saw the warning signs and flew anyway. This is the story of the Shadow Astronaut Corps, the men who paid for the moon landing with their lives and then vanished from history. Their names aren't in the textbooks. Their faces don't appear in the documentaries. But without their deaths, without the lessons written in their blood, we never would have made it to the moon at all. Walk into the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex today and you'll find a monument, the Space Mirror Memorial, a wall of polished black granite, names etched in stone, backlit so they seem to float in space. It's beautiful, it's solemn, and it's incomplete. The official story of the space race is clean. It's inspirational. It's Mercury 7 astronauts in silver suits, grinning at cameras. It's John Glenn orbiting Earth. It's Kennedy's speech about choosing to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The official story is about triumph, about American ingenuity conquering the impossible, about brave men riding pillars of fire into the heavens and coming home heroes. But there's another story, a shadow story, and it begins with a simple question. How many astronauts died before we reached the moon? Ask most people, and they'll remember Apollo 1. 3 men, Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, killed in a fire on the launch pad in 1967. It's the tragedy everyone knows, the one NASA couldn't hide because it happened in front of hundreds of witnesses and made headlines around the world. But Apollo 1 wasn't the beginning. It wasn't even close. Between 1964 and 1968, at least 8 astronauts and test pilots died in the line of duty, some in training accidents, some in classified military programs, some in ways that technically don't count as spaceflight fatalities because of arbitrary definitions about where the atmosphere ends and space begins. Theodore Freeman, Charles Bassett, Elliot See, Clifton Williams, Robert Lawrence, Michael Adams, and yes, Grissom, White, and Chaffee. 8 men, 8 families who got a folded flag and a closed casket. 8 names that should be as famous as Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins, but aren't. Why? Because these deaths were inconvenient. Because acknowledging them would mean acknowledging that NASA was pushing too hard, moving too fast, ignoring warning signs in a desperate race against the Soviet Union. Because in the Cold War calculus of the 1960s, dead astronauts were bad for morale, bad for funding, bad for the narrative that America was destined to win. So they were erased. Not officially, not with malice, but through the quiet bureaucracy of institutional forgetting. Their accidents were ruled training incidents rather than spaceflight fatalities. Their programs were classified. Their deaths were mentioned briefly in the press and then buried under the next launch, the next milestone, the next triumph. The pattern was systematic. The erasure was deliberate. And it all started on Halloween 1964. Theodore Freeman was 34 years old, a husband, a father to a young daughter, and one of the brightest engineering minds in the astronaut corps. Selected in 1963 as part of the New 14, the third group of astronauts NASA recruited, Freeman was exactly the kind of man the space program needed. University of Michigan engineering degree, naval aviator, test pilot, The kind of guy who could fly anything and fix anything, who understood the physics of orbital mechanics as well as he understood how to coax a jet through a thunderstorm. He was supposed to fly to the moon. He almost certainly would have, given his skills and his position in the crew rotation. But on October 31st, 1964, Theodore Freeman became the first astronaut to die in the line of duty. He was flying a routine training mission that morning, piloting a T-38 Talon jet out of Ellington Air Force Base near Houston. The T-38 was NASA's workhorse, a sleek, supersonic trainer that astronauts use to maintain their flying proficiency and to travel between NASA facilities. Fast, nimble, reliable. Except when you hit a bird at 1,500 feet. A snow goose. A single bird in the wrong place at the wrong time, sucked into the left engine intake of Freeman's jet. The engine disintegrated. The aircraft lurched, hemorrhaging thrust and altitude. Freeman had seconds to make a decision. He could have ejected immediately, punched out, and let the jet crash wherever momentum and gravity took it. But there were neighborhoods below, houses full of families. So Freeman did what test pilots are trained to do. He stayed with the aircraft, wrestling it away from populated areas, giving himself just enough time to steer clear before pulling the ejection handle. He waited too long. When he finally ejected, the T-38 was only 200 feet above the ground, well below the minimum safe altitude for the ejection system to work properly. His parachute deployed, but there wasn't enough time for it to slow his descent. Theodore Freeman hit the ground at lethal speed and died on impact. NASA called it a tragic accident, an act of God, a freak encounter with wildlife that no amount of training or preparation could have prevented. And in a sense, they were right. You can't predict when a bird will cross your flight path. But here's what NASA didn't say. Freeman's death should have been a wake-up call about the risks of high-performance jet training. The T-38 program was pushing astronauts to fly constantly, to rack up flight hours in a jet that was unforgiving of mistakes, to operate at the edge of performance envelopes because that's what spaceflight would demand. Instead of reassessing those risks, NASA treated Freeman's death as an isolated incident. No significant safety modifications were implemented. The T-38 program continued unchanged, and the message was clear. Astronauts were expected to accept these risks as part of the job. If you died in training, well, that was the price of being on the team. Theodore Freeman's name was added to the Space Mirror Memorial, eventually. But his death was quickly overshadowed by the program's momentum, by the next mission, the next milestone. The first astronaut to die became the first astronaut to be forgotten. And the T-38 wasn't done killing. February 28, 1966, St. Louis, Missouri, dense fog blankets, Lambert Field, the kind of weather that turns the world into a gray void where the ground and sky blur into a single, suffocating nothing. Visibility is near zero. Any sensible pilot would divert, land somewhere clear, wait for the weather to pass. But Elliot See and Charles Bassett aren't just any pilots. They're astronauts, prime crew for Gemini 9, and they need to get to the McDonnell Aircraft Plant in St. Louis to inspect their spacecraft and run through simulator training. The mission is weeks away. The schedule is tight. They're behind, so they fly into the fog. See is in the left seat, the pilot in command. Bassett is his crewmate, his partner, the man he'll fly with into orbit. They're in a T-38, the same jet that killed Ted Freeman 16 months earlier. See begins an instrument approach, relying on his gauges and radio navigation, because he can't see anything outside the cockpit windows. Just gray, just fog, just the needles on his instruments telling him where the runway should be. He misjudges the altitude. Maybe the instruments are slightly off. Maybe he's a few degrees too steep on the approach angle. Maybe the fog is playing tricks with his depth perception. It doesn't matter. What matters is that the T-38 comes in too low, too fast, and slams into the roof of Building 101, the very building that houses the Gemini 9 spacecraft they've flown here to inspect. The jet disintegrates. Elliot See and Charles Bassett are killed instantly. The debris from their aircraft damages the spacecraft they were supposed to fly. The irony is almost too cruel to process. They died crashing into their own mission. NASA's crew rotation system was rigid, almost mechanical in its logic. If a prime crew couldn't fly, the backup crew moved up. Simple, clean, no room for sentiment. So when See and Bassett died, their backup crew, Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan, became the new prime crew for Gemini 9. The men who had been waiting one level below Stafford and Cernan, Jim Lovell and Buzz Aldrin, moved into the backup positions. And that shift, that single rotation caused by a crash in a St. Louis fog, cascaded through the entire astronaut roster like falling dominoes. Crew assignments for future Gemini and Apollo missions shifted. The carefully orchestrated sequence of who flew when, who gained experience on which missions, who would be positioned for the first lunar landing attempts, all of it changed because two men flew into weather they shouldn't have. Here's the stunning part. If Elliot See had pulled up 2 seconds earlier, if he'd cleared that rooftop by 10 feet instead of hitting it, Buzz Aldrin probably never walks on the moon. The second man to set foot on the lunar surface, one of the most famous astronauts in history, got there because of a training accident in bad weather. History turned on seconds. On fog, on a judgment call that went wrong. 2 more T-38 crashes, 2 more dead astronauts. And still, NASA hadn't learned its lesson. But there was something even more dangerous than a high-performance jet waiting in the program's future. Something that had already killed people in tests that NASA knew nothing about. A spacecraft filled with pure oxygen. To understand what happened on January 27, 1967, you need to understand combustion chemistry. In normal air, the stuff you're breathing right now, oxygen makes up about 21% of the atmosphere. Nitrogen and other gases make up the rest. This mixture is what we evolved to breathe, and it has a convenient side effect. It's relatively hard to start a fire, and fires that do start spread at manageable speeds. But pure oxygen is different. Wildly, terrifyingly different. NASA designed its early spacecraft to use 100% oxygen atmospheres at reduced pressure, about 5 pounds per square inch instead of the normal 14.7 at sea level. The reasoning was sound from an engineering perspective. Pure oxygen systems were simpler, lighter, and eliminated the need for heavy nitrogen tanks and complex gas mixing equipment. Every pound saved was a pound that could go toward fuel, instruments, or payload. But in pure oxygen, the rules of fire change completely. Materials that are merely flammable in normal air become explosively combustible. Things that won't even burn in regular atmosphere, metals, supposedly fire-resistant fabrics, plastics rated as non-flammable, can ignite and burn with terrifying speed in pure oxygen. The flame propagation rate increases by orders of magnitude. A spark that would smolder and die in normal air becomes an inferno in seconds. The military knew this. Between 1962 and 1965, the U.S. Air Force experienced multiple oxygen fire incidents in pressure chamber tests. Test subjects suffered severe burns. The risks of high oxygen environments were documented, studied, written up in reports that gathered dust in classified filing cabinets. But those reports never made it to NASA. Cold War compartmentalization meant that military test data stayed military. Civilian space program engineers, working just miles away from Air Force facilities, had no access to the lessons the military had learned in blood and burns. 3 agencies, 3 sets of fire victims, 0 communication. NASA was building a death trap, and the information existed to prevent it. But the information was classified, siloed, locked away behind security clearances and interagency bureaucracy. So, NASA engineers kept designing spacecraft with pure oxygen atmospheres, kept filling cabins with Velcro and nylon netting and foam padding, kept installing complex inward opening hatches that required minutes to unseal. And in 1967, 3 men paid the price for that institutional blindness. January 27, 1967, Launch Complex 34, Cape Kennedy. The Apollo 1 crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, are strapped into their spacecraft for a plugs-out test, a full dress rehearsal of launch procedures. It's considered routine. The Saturn rocket beneath them isn't even fueled. This is just a systems check, a practice run to make sure everything works before the real launch. The test is plagued with problems from the start. Communication glitches, strange smells in the cabin, minor technical issues that pile up into frustration. Grissom, a veteran of Mercury and Gemini missions, is increasingly vocal about his concerns with the Apollo spacecraft. He's told colleagues that it has problems, that it's not ready, that he doesn't trust it. At 6:31 p.m., someone reports a fire in the cabin. In the pure oxygen atmosphere, pressurized to 16.7 pounds per square inch for the ground test, the fire spreads with a speed that defies comprehension, less than 15 seconds. That's all it takes for the entire cabin to be engulfed in flames. 15 seconds for the temperature inside to reach thousands of degrees. 15 seconds for the pressure to spike so high that the hull ruptures. The crew tries to open the hatch. It's an inward opening design, held shut by the pressure differential. The higher the pressure inside, the tighter it seals. Under normal conditions, it takes minutes to unseal the multiple latches and remove the hatch. Under fire conditions, with pressure spiking and smoke filling the cabin, it's impossible. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee die within minutes, killed by asphyxiation and thermal burns in a spacecraft sitting on the ground, not even fueled for flight. They die in a test that was supposed to be safe. They die because NASA used a pure oxygen atmosphere that turned their cabin into a bomb. Because the spacecraft was filled with flammable materials. Because the hatch couldn't be opened quickly. Because every design decision that killed them was a known risk that had been documented, studied, and filed away where the people building Apollo would never see it. The Apollo 1 fire forced NASA to stop, to redesign, to implement changes that should have been made years earlier. Outward opening hatches that could be unsealed in seconds. Nitrogen-oxygen mixed atmospheres that reduced flammability. Fire-resistant materials throughout the cabin. Improved wiring and systems to prevent ignition sources. These changes made Apollo safe. They made the moon landing possible, but they came too late for Grissom, White, and Chaffee. The Apollo 1 tragedy is the one everyone remembers because NASA couldn't hide it. It happened in front of hundreds of technicians and engineers. It made headlines around the world. It forced congressional hearings and investigations. The agency had no choice but to acknowledge it, to learn from it, to change. But there were other astronauts dying in programs so classified that NASA could pretend they never existed at all. June 30th, 1967. The U.S. Air Force announces the selection of astronauts for the Manned Orbiting Laboratory Program, MOL for short. It's a classified military space station project, essentially a spy satellite with astronauts on board, designed to conduct reconnaissance missions that automated systems couldn't handle. The program is so secret that most of the astronauts' work will never be publicly acknowledged. Among the selectees is Major Robert Henry Lawrence, Jr. He's 31 years old, a PhD in physical chemistry, an Air Force test pilot with impeccable credentials, and he's the first African American ever selected as an astronaut. This should have been a historic moment. This should have been front-page news, a milestone in the civil rights era, proof that the space program was finally opening its doors to the talent and courage of all Americans. But because MOL is classified, because the program's very existence is a military secret, Lawrence's selection receives minimal press coverage. No ticker tape parade, no magazine covers, Just a brief announcement and then silence. Robert Lawrence will train for a space station that will never fly. He will prepare for missions that will never launch. And 6 months after his selection, he will die in a training accident that most of America will never hear about. December 8, 1967. Edwards Air Force Base, California. Lawrence is in the back seat of an F-104 starfighter, serving as an instructor pilot for a training flight. They're practicing steep descent approaches, extreme angle landings that simulate the approach profile a spacecraft would use returning from orbit. It's dangerous flying, pushing the F-104 to the edge of its performance envelope, diving toward the runway at angles that leave almost no margin for error. The pilot in the front seat misjudges the approach. The F-104 comes in too steep, too fast. It slams into the runway with catastrophic force. The front seat pilot survives, ejecting just before impact. Robert Lawrence in the back seat is killed instantly. Because MOL is classified, Lawrence's death receives minimal press coverage. Because MOL will be canceled in 1969 without ever flying a mission, Lawrence's selection as an astronaut isn't officially recognized for decades. He becomes a ghost, a man who trained for space, who died in the line of duty, but who doesn't appear in the official histories because acknowledging him would mean acknowledging the program he died for. Robert Lawrence should have been celebrated as a pioneer, as a trailblazer who broke barriers in one of the most exclusive and challenging fields in human history. Instead, he died in a classified program for a space station that never flew and spent 3 decades erased from the record. It wasn't until 2007, 40 years after his death, that NASA added Robert Lawrence's name to the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center. 40 years before the first African-American astronaut was officially acknowledged. 40 years of institutional amnesia, of convenient forgetting, of letting a hero fade into obscurity because remembering him would be complicated. Lawrence's erasure wasn't just about classification, it was about convenience. Acknowledging him would mean confronting NASA's own lack of diversity, admitting that the civilian space program had failed to select a black astronaut while the military had done so in 1967. It was easier to let him become a ghost. But Robert Lawrence wasn't the only astronaut whose death doesn't officially count. There was another pilot who actually made it to space and died on the way back down. The X-15 rocket plane is one of the most extraordinary aircraft ever built. Launched from under the wing of a B-52 bomber, powered by a rocket engine that burns ammonia and liquid oxygen, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 6 and altitudes above 50 miles. The X-15 bridged the gap between aviation and spaceflight. It was a research platform, a testbed for technologies that would later be used in the space shuttle, and a proving ground for pilots who wanted to touch the edge of space. 12 pilots flew the X-15 above 50 miles, the altitude the U.S. Air Force defined as the boundary of space. 8 of them received astronaut wings for those flights, officially recognized as astronauts by the military, even though they never orbited Earth, never flew a capsule, never launched on a rocket. One of those pilots was Major Michael James Adams. He was 37 years old, an Air Force test pilot, a man who had dreamed of flying higher and faster than anyone else. On November 15, 1967, he got his chance. Flight 3-65-97. Adams's 7th flight in the X-15 and his first attempt to reach space altitude. The mission profile called for a high-altitude zoom climb, light the rocket, point the nose up, and ride the momentum to the edge of the atmosphere before gliding back down. The ascent was perfect. Adams reached a peak altitude of about 266,000 feet, approximately 81 kilometers, well above the 50-mile threshold the U.S. military used to define space. For a few moments, Michael Adams was an astronaut, floating in the black sky above the curve of the Earth. But the descent went wrong. The X-15's control systems malfunctioned. The aircraft entered a hypersonic spin, tumbling end over end at speeds exceeding Mach 5. Adams fought to regain control, but the aerodynamic forces were too extreme. The X-15 broke apart at approximately 65,000 feet. Michael Adams died in the disintegration, his aircraft scattering across the Mojave Desert in thousands of pieces. He had reached space. He had earned his astronaut wings, awarded posthumously by the Air Force. But Michael Adams's death is not officially counted as a spaceflight fatality. Why? Because of an arbitrary line drawn in the sky. The U.S. military defines space as beginning at 50 miles, 80 kilometers. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, the international body that certifies aviation and spaceflight records, uses the Kármán line at 100 kilometers. Adams flew above the U.S. definition, but below the international one. And because the X-15 flights are generally treated as aeronautical research rather than spaceflight missions, because they didn't orbit, because they landed on runways like planes instead of splashing down in oceans like capsules, Adams's death exists in a bureaucratic limbo. He died during a mission to space. He earned astronaut wings, but he doesn't count. The definition problem is absurd, a technicality that erases a man's sacrifice because he died on the wrong side of an imaginary boundary. Michael Adams reached space, lost his life returning from it, and was quietly forgotten because his death didn't fit the narrative of what spaceflight was supposed to be. 8 men, 8 deaths between 1964 and 1968, in the years leading up to Apollo 11. Theodore Freeman, killed by a bird strike in a T-38. Elliot See and Charles Bassett, killed in a fog-shrouded crash in St. Louis. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, killed in the Apollo 1 fire. Robert Lawrence, killed in an F-104 crash while training for a classified space station. Michael Adams, killed when his X-15 broke apart during re-entry. Some of these deaths were freak accidents, acts of God that no amount of preparation could have prevented. But most were systemic failures, the result of an agency and a nation pushing too hard, moving too fast, ignoring warning signs in a desperate race against the Soviet Union. They were the cost of Cold War hubris, of a space program that valued speed over safety, secrecy over transparency, the mission over the men. And they were erased, not with malice, not through conspiracy, but through the quiet bureaucracy of institutional forgetting. Their deaths were ruled training accidents instead of spaceflight fatalities. Their programs were classified. Their names were left off memorials for decades. They became ghosts, shadows, footnotes in a story that preferred to remember only the triumphs. But here's the truth that NASA eventually had to learn. You can't reach the moon without acknowledging the cost. Every triumph in the space race was built on lessons written in blood. Theodore Freeman's death taught NASA about the risks of high-performance jet training. See and Bassett's crash revealed the dangers of pushing schedules in bad weather. The Apollo 1 fire forced a complete redesign of the spacecraft, implementing safety measures that made lunar missions possible. Robert Lawrence and Michael Adams died in programs that pushed the boundaries of what humans could survive, testing technologies and procedures that would later save lives. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They weren't just tragic accidents to be swept under the rug and forgotten. They were the foundation upon which Apollo 11 was built. Every safety protocol, every design change, every lesson learned came from someone who didn't come home. On July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and spoke those famous words, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he was walking on ground that 8 other men had died trying to reach. Their names should have been on his lips. Their faces should have been in the mission patch. Their sacrifice should have been acknowledged in that moment of triumph. Instead, they became the Shadow Astronaut Corps, the men who paid for the moon landing with their lives and then vanished from history. But they're not forgotten anymore. Their names are slowly being added to memorials, their stories finally being told. Because the truth about the space race isn't just about triumph and courage and American ingenuity. It's also about cost, about sacrifice, about the men who died so that others could succeed. 8 men, 8 deaths, 8 names that should be as famous as Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins. Theodore Freeman, Elliot See Charles Bassett, Virgil Grissom, Edward White, Roger Chaffee, Robert Lawrence, Michael Adams. Remember them, because they paid for the stars with their lives, and they deserve more than silence. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more stories where history, technology, and human ambition collide. Thanks for watching.